Welcome again, all. Dr. JC here, week 11. Holy smokes, week 11. Crazy how fast this is going. I'm going to spend some time this lecture, and I'll keep it in one part. I'm going to talk specifically about the Mongols and also this period of wrenching change in Europe, especially Western Europe, known as the Black Death. Thus, I'd ask everyone, as you consider which one of these two parts you're going to make comment on, whether it's the Mongols or Black Death, that you do a little background research on your own. And I say that because both of these topics, like most other aspects of the course, I suppose, we could easily spend 16 weeks on alone. So I'm going to kind of take us on a trip down the buffet line here, so to speak. And if there's something that you find along this trip that you strikes your fancy or you happen to like, I'd ask that you go back to that buffet line, do a little more research, and then perhaps write about that in the forum. So let's start with the Mongols. Geographically, the Mongols are located in the central steppes of Asia. In the early 1200s, different ethnic groups that would still consider themselves to be Mongolian will be brought together under the leadership of this individual by the name of Genghis Khan. And over the next couple hundred years, the 1200s and 1300s, they're just going to grow to be the largest contiguous land empire in history. No big deal. Yeah, it's a big deal. And we'll talk about how they did it. Much of the Mongolian conquest is going to be set about through the use of what we might call the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid, right? They will alter existing technologies in simple ways to specifically fit what they have in mind as it relates to the way they want to do war, the way they want to wage war, their war fighting. And they'll be masters at using psychological warfare and other means as well, to include perhaps biological warfare. As mentioned previously, the Mongols are going to come together en masse underneath the leadership of Genghis Khan. While Khan's army is never going to be that big, relatively speaking, especially as it relates to other ancient armies, the composition of the army, mostly cavalry, and the speed at which these cats are going to be able to move and strike is unparalleled. Oftentimes we associate the term blitzkrieg or lightning war with World War II in Germany. I think your original blitzkrieg or lightning war is right here with the Mongols. A few select simple changes I want to talk about that the Mongolians made to existing technologies are listed here on this slide. They're going to change the way the bow is established or set up, the use of a saber and the blade, and they're going to make use of this little piece of metal that people can put their feet in called a stirrup. Starting with the bow first, the long bow was the bow that was generally used in combat by various nations' armies. The problem with a long bow, however, is how do you make that work when you're trying to stay in the saddle? It was impractical. Therefore, what the Mongolians did was monkeyed around with the design of the limbers and came up with what we might consider a compound bow today. The bow was smaller, stored more energy in the limbers, thus the kinetic or killing power there was increased, especially at short range, and it was something that you could use on horseback. Mongolians also moved away from a broadsword, a straight sword, to one that had a curve to it. The change here again was a practical one. If you are on horseback, charging into opposing enemy's infantry, the last thing you want to do is try to strike the opposing infantry with a straight sword. You are going to either be knocked out of your saddle or dislocate your shoulder. With a curved blade, however, you can quite literally slice your way through. Regarding the stirrup, this was a change. Most people would think, well, heck, if you're going to be on horseback, you put your feet in a stirrup. We know that. Well, guess what? Romans thought it unmanly to use a stirrup. The stirrup wasn't always used in the ancient world. It was not. Yet for Mongolians, because the focus was the use of the sword or the bow for offensive capabilities, striking power, striking speed, you had to be able to remain in the saddle. Therefore, the stirrup was actually very necessary. One other brief innovation I wanted to talk about here as it relates to Mongolians in warfare was their use of leather versus armor. As you may well know and imagine, leather's a lot lighter than metal. Therefore, if you want to move with speed, you don't want to slow yourself or your horse down, keep it light. While leather generally doesn't have the same protective sort of qualities as metal, the use of leather and the way they used leather here by the Mongolians did provide greater protection. That's where this lamellar lacing comes in. Think of it almost like scales on a fish. In fact, there was a Mythbusters, I don't know the episode, you guys could probably Google it, where the Chinese actually used paper armor in this sort of lamellar fashion, and they did find that it could paper stop an arrow. So clearly leather, using this lamellar lacing, could provide some protective qualities while also maintaining what? Lightness for more efficient movement and mobility. Pretty cool. Before talking briefly about Mongolian tactics, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention something about Mongolian horses. Most all Mongolian cavalrymen maintained 2 horses, in some cases 3 or 4. The idea that you have more horses is that you can rotate horses out and not get out of the saddle. There are instances where Mongolian cavalrymen would travel upwards of 100 miles in a day. Think of the advantages with that speed, not just in communication of messages and coordination of different components of one's army, but the ability to strike deep into the heart of enemy country at little moment's notice. That's where the psychological aspect will come into play too. It's really rather Viking in a way. Just as the English didn't know where the Vikings were going to land, the same holds true with the Mongolians. You just didn't know when they were going to show up. They were always in the back of your mind, always in that gray matter. And if they're in your head, Sun Tzu's loving this, right? So how did these Mongolians then go about making war, waging war, war fighting? Rather than get into each one of these different tactics, I'm just going to focus on a couple here. For those interested, I would ask that you research it further, because if there were students of Sun Tzu's, they'd have to be the Mongolians. And I'm not saying the Mongolians read Sun Tzu, but Sun Tzu would probably point to them as a case study and say, see, what's one of those great maxims from Sun Tzu? Know thy enemy and know thyself, and in 100 battles you'll never be in peril. Because most armies stopped fighting in winter and went into winter quarters, they stopped offensive operations. Guess what the Mongolians did? Said, well, heck, if you're going to go ahead and take tea and sit by the fire, I'm going to kick your butt when you don't expect it. They generally attacked during the winter, when least expected. They would make use of deception whenever possible. One example of that is they'd have a small contingent of cavalry break away from the main body, tie up huge bundles of sticks and twigs and whatever else they could, and drag them through the dust. That way, if an enemy force was looking for a big dust cloud saying, wow, they must all be over there, that was the illusion that the Mongols wanted the other side to think. Get the enemy to look in the wrong direction, and then strike them from an unexpected source or point. Masters of psychological warfare and deception. Before I turn next briefly to the impact of the Mongols and this creation of this largest continuous land empire in history, I wanted to talk briefly about their use of or demand of tribute. Mongolians generally always opted for demands of tribute rather than to control or hold geographic space. Demanding tribute made the most sense. You had an immediate source of income, you could pay your soldiers, you could continue your offensive operations, and by not maintaining a garrison or a fort in somebody else's backyard, you weren't siphoning troops off from your own army, or for that matter, creating an insurgency. All you had to do was threaten the other side and say, look, we will come back at any time, and when we come back, you better have a paycheck ready for us. You better have the gold ready for us. Almost like saying it's like protection money. Guido and Rocco could come around at any point, have the envelope ready when they come, or we'll bust up your place. Again, psychological warfare worked amazingly well. Rather than look at all areas and aspects of Mongolian conquest, I'm going to focus specifically on the Middle East here. In an earlier lecture, we talked about Islam's golden age. Harun al-Rashid, the creation of this Abbasid dynasty, the beginning of this golden age of Islam, where Baghdad was the center of all things. They had this grand library, this Bait al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom. All that will be brought to an end by the Mongols. Well, you can read here and perhaps do some additional research as to the siege and ultimate destruction of Baghdad. I wanted to take a minute here to talk about the importance of Baghdad to the Mongols. For psychological reasons, again, this was important to the Mongols. Not only was the wealth and power of the Abbasid dynasty destroyed here, but so too was the world's first global religion. Think of the psychological power here. If Allah cannot protect you from us, what power can, whether living or supernatural? This would lead to a sense of Mongolian invincibility. And in a way, this is going to be part of their own undoing. And part of that undoing is going to come from technology. The Mongols are going to run into the Mamluks here at the Battle of Ain Jalut. And the Mamluks are going to be armed with this thing called a hand cannon. It is a very early version of what we might call a rifled musket. Therefore, on the 3rd of September 1260, while these hand cannon aren't going to kill many Mongolians, they certainly are going to scare the piss out of the Mongolian horses and break up their attack. And as you may well imagine, the rest of the known world is going to want to know what helped defeat the Mongols. Everyone's going to want a hand cannon. While Mongolian decline isn't going to happen overnight, again, these guys are going to be around a couple centuries, it will eventually come, in part because they don't have a capital city. They don't have a place to do research and development, and therefore they're always going to be behind the technological curve. It's a problem. Rather than work through all aspects of their legacy, some of which are listed here on this slide, I want to focus on the last piece here, the idea that perhaps the Black Death was brought to Europe by the Mongols themselves. Whether they carried this knowingly or unknowingly is subject to, in some sense, ad nauseum debate. What we do know, however, from some accounts is that they did understand something was afoot during this siege of the city of Kaffa in 1345 and 1346. Within the Mongol camp itself besieging the city, individuals began to contract some type of disease, and within 4 days, they're gone. Bye-bye. Dead. One can only imagine maybe the thought or fear within the Mongols themselves. Like, woo, okay, we defeated that god Allah in Baghdad, but now we might be up against some different Christian god here in Kaffa, and he's casting like poo-poo spells on us. One can only imagine what they were thinking. The end of the day, they decided, you know what, discretion's the better part of valor. We're going to blow this pop stand. We're out of here. Yet prior to leaving, they figured, let's just go ahead and give them folks a little something something inside the city. And by some accounts, bodies of infected individuals were catapulted over the walls into the city of Kaffa. Does this give us some indication of the first use of biological or germ warfare? Perhaps. But hey, it's the Mongolian way, baby. Always leave them with a little fear and a little doubt. And while the Mongols may have beat feet and retreated, they left behind something much more insidious. The Black Death. Over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, from roughly about 1346, 47 to 1351, and by the way, this will come back at different points during European history as well, the Black Death. Tens of millions, yes, with an N, millions of Europeans are going to die from this. While numbers are going to vary based on geographic locale, anywhere from 30 to 60% of European society is going to die. On a more recent research trip to Norway, while in Bergen, I was at a leprosy museum, and I found out there that the population of Norway decreased by 50%. And in fact, it wouldn't be until 1850, 500 years after the Black Death came through, that Norway's population would equal what it was in 1350. Think about that. 500 years for the population to rebound. Imagine the shock across Europe. Now, this is part of the feudal age. You're supposed to be protected by your feudal lord or by the Catholic Church. And when this Black Death rolls through and family members start to die within 4 days, and you approach your feudal lord and ask for help, and he shrugs his shoulders, and when you approach the Catholic Church and your local priest can't do anything but shrug his shoulders and not give you any sort of explanation, what are you to think? Maybe what I'll do then is I'll go ahead and pick out one middle finger for you, feudal lord, and the other one you, church, and I'll get an answer myself. I'll look to science and I will look to nature if need be for an answer. But I have family members, I have kids dying, and I need an answer. Thus the Black Death killed lots of people, but it also killed the social order of the day. Feudalism is going to die because of this. People are going to begin to start to look to science and nature, the classics. What did the Greeks and Romans do? So when we talk about the Renaissance or rebirth of Europe later in the course, I want you to remember the Black Death. I'll be looking forward to your posts on the Mongols or the Black Death in the coming days. Dr. JC out. week 11.